Okay, we're in the home stretch here of this lecture. Lots more that could be said, but I was just at the end of the last segment mentioning a table. Pay attention to this table. This and the diagram I just showed you are what the quiz are going to be about, okay? So this particular table, it is table 19. You've got that on your handout here. And what Bourdieu is doing here is pretty incredible. On the columns, he's divided French society in 1978 into three classes. So manual workers, think blue-collar workers, clerical or junior execs. You can think of these are people that have kind of lower rung, white-collar jobs, maybe went to college, they work in offices. And in the third column there, these are people with quite kind of a lot of economic power, economic capital, industrialists, so think business owners or executives, thinks of white-collar folks who the ones who drove our economy into a mess if they worked at banks in 2008. And then he has this great thing where all these rows are these cool categories. And what he did is he gave surveys to people, and he'd say, okay, so you think there, he'd say, all right, when you do kind of spontaneous invite people over for dinner, do you invite close family, yes or no? Well, 52% of manual workers say, oh yeah, well, yeah, when I invite people over spontaneously, I invite close family. But executives, only a third of them do that. Or he'd go further down and he'd say, okay, so do you invite people over for coffee? Very often, oh yeah, manual workers, 50% of them. But do you invite people for dessert? Manual workers, only 23%, but even less kind of executives. And then he asked if you keep going down here, so when people come over, do you use silverware? Manual workers, not so much, about a quarter of them do. But oh, look over here. Executives, those with economic capital, oh, they do lots of kind of fine kind of silverware. And what he's trying to show here is that this first column, they have lots of economic or not much economic capital, not much cultural capital. The third column have lots of economic capital, but might not have much cultural capital. And the middle column, so these are people with liberal arts degrees, right, who care a lot about ideas and good books and that sort of thing. They might not have much economic capital, but might have a lot of cultural capital. So he's taking spaces or points from that last diagram I showed you, and he's using columns to express the taste, which are all these rows, of different points from that figure I showed you before. So he's using the information here to try and give you a sense of like, why is it that these objective patterns in the social world, so the whole thing I began the lecture with, why is it that these objective patterns we experience subjectively as our own unique taste? Why is it though that you can, through a survey, show that people in very specific realms, so these columns of economic classes, end up having very similar patterns. It can't all be about subjectivity. Instead, some of it's got to be about that there's this system of cultural capital that's going on that we can define just as clearly as we can define economic capital. So he's giving us sociologists a different tool, a different way of thinking about of how inequality and distinctions, and this is important because that's actually the name of this book, how distinctions happen. And by distinctions, he means how cultural capital, how taste, distinguishing this from that. Think about our classification week we had before the exam, how that distinction, how that deployment of taste as cultural capital can actually be a resource in a field of struggle. So showing I like this and not that, so therefore I'm like this and I'm not like them. He's showing us how this cultural capital works. Now, very quickly, I'm going to give you finally one bit of explanation here about this tricky word called habitus that he talks about. Now, I'm going to talk about this again next week because in the book Privilege that we're going to start reading next week, it's a very important concept. But let me give you some of the outlines here. So the problem after talking about field and after talking about capital, that Bourdieu found himself with and that we find ourselves with is, okay, it's all in good to show this economic capital exists, cultural capital exists, yeah, so what? So what Bourdieu needs to understand is, how is it that these very particular tastes, so these patterns of taste that he's pointing out to us, how do those get inside us? And how do they get inside us in such a way that we think they're subjective, that we think we've made decisions about good taste, but sociologists looking can see patterns of taste that seem to be connected with particular social and economic groups, those columns from the table that I just showed you. How is it that that happens? And Bourdieu comes up with this rather ingenious kind of way of explaining how this taste gets inside of us. So go in your handout, that excerpted reading now, to Figure 8. It's on page 171 of the handout, but it's called Figure 8. It's this thing right here. Now, what Bourdieu is doing here is he is telling us, he's explaining in this diagram what he means by this concept of habitus. So habitus is an unconscious structure that is developed in early environments, so our childhood experiences, particularly material environments, that develops in us particular ways of seeing and interacting with the world, and develops in us the particular taste, or what he begins to call dispositions, that we have towards the social world. This process, you may have heard from introductory sociology class, and we've even mentioned in this class, is oftentimes called socialization. In other words, how does society get into us? He doesn't call it socialization for a couple of important reasons. One, Bourdieu is not talking about how values get inside of us. Instead, he's talking about how particular taste, particular dispositions we have to things in the social world, why we're drawn to certain things, certain behaviors, certain types of food, certain occupations. So these patterns of being drawn in particular ways, he calls dispositions. He wants to know how those happen. And for him, it's not about values whatsoever. So he says, I'm not going to use socialization language because that's often about values. Two, he's focusing on material realities, so the environments, the early environments that we grow up in. So whether we're born into a rich family or whether we're born into a poor family, despite the fact that we have a great American mythology that tells us you can be anything, we find as sociologists over and over and again pretty interesting patterns that if you're born in this place, this class, this condition, or born in this one, there is a close correlation between what your children will end up doing and liking and being like, given what you give birth to them into. So the environment you grow up in, or the environment you raise your children in, has these effects over time of creating these dispositions, this material environment, this economic world that you're born into has that sort of power. And finally, he doesn't use socialization because what he's showing us is that we're not all generated into one American disposition, but instead we develop different habitus based on particular environments we're born into. So class and material and economic environments, but also maybe regional environments, or maybe national environments, or maybe different kind of cultural environments. So he gives us this really interesting way to think about how the world, the social world we're in, becomes a part of us. And this diagram here is the rather complex way of explaining it with some really fancy schmancy language, right? So you could even say that Bourdieu, in some ways, almost fell victim to what he was trying to unveil, which was Bourdieu gives us some really complex language, some more cultural capital for you and I as intellectuals if we wanted to deploy to make us look smart to our sociological colleagues. But let's not be too critical of him yet and say, he's just doing the same thing over again. Let's say that he's actually helping us to understand how the social world works. So what this chart says is that there are objectively classifiable conditions of existence. In other words, the economic class environment that you're born into. They create a particular habitus. So somebody born into a blue-collar environment will have a different disposition or habitus than others do. Somebody born with a golden spoon in their mouth or a silver spoon in their mouth, who they have no food on the table is never a problem. They get whatever they want. They'll have a different habitus, which is this category here. And then this habitus, unconsciously, it generates very particular classifiable practices and works. So particular ways of, do you use the china or not when you have guests over? Do you serve dessert or not when you have guests over? Do you invite your boss over on a whim or not? Do you invite your family over on a whim or not? Do you sing songs after dinner or not? So these very classifiable practices, which you and I as sociologists can figure out. We can do surveys and classify them. We can actually see whether these practices are what people and what classes do them. And it creates this subjective, this habitus, this disposition, creates a subjective sense of taste that we've been talking about. So this subjective sense that you and I have of like, oh, it's my individual taste. Oh, no, 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 according to Bourdieu. No. Instead, this habitus, rooted back to these class economic environments, creates this taste. And then we get to these very particular behaviors that we read about in that table. And then boom, we have this thing that we might call a lifestyle that we think is about choice and is about our own particular life trajectory. But Bourdieu says, no, 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 no. It was all based back in here to begin with. And you can see, again, on this kind of second level, he has how this conditioning, and this arrow here is about conditioning, how this conditioning can happen in other conditions of existence. And as I'll talk about last week, he's got this sense that there's kind of different levels by which the habitus gets formed, or different experiences that form the habitus unconsciously. I'll talk more about that last week. But what I wanted you to get was kind of the broad vision. So I've covered, Pierre Bourdieu wrote 8 books this size to talk about these 3 concepts: field, capital, and habitus. I've covered it all in one a lecture for you. And what I want you to see is that he's really unveiling kind of a trick. So he's unveiling how the material, objective social world that we're born into, which we thought a little bit about with Durkheim, he's showing us how it operates differently than Durkheim said it operates, that it gets into us in these dispositions that make us perceive and want certain things in the social world, and makes it seem natural to us that we perceive and want those sorts of things. But that if we look carefully, we can see that certain dispositions are created based on shared economic or shared material environments, especially as we grew up. And so you get different outcomes. You get different cultural capital, and this different cultural capital can be used in the field of inequality to make us look different than others. So we'll learn a lot more about this in reading the Kahn book, but we have the theory laid out for us. And remember again that for Bourdieu, there's always this sense of a field, of a social game, a social contest that is occurring, that he is trying to unveil and he is trying to get us to see. So we'll stop there for right now. There's much more that can be said, but make sure you understand these concepts. Make sure you look at the tables and the diagrams, because that's what our quiz